All right. So thinking about maybe taking that next big step in your life, maybe it involves going to a university in a place where they speak English or a visa that needs you to prove how well you speak English,
Yeah.
or even, just getting that dream job overseas.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the IELTS, it's a big deal for a lot of people out there trying to reach, academic or professional goals all over the world. It can really open doors. And that's why we are doing this super deep dive, going past just the surface to really get what this test is all about. Like what forms it comes in, the skills it actually tests, and especially, the smart ways you can tackle each part of it.
Okay, so that makes sense. So for anyone who's maybe like totally new to this whole IELTS thing, can you just like explain what it actually is?
Sure. So the IELTS, which stands for International English Language Testing System, it's basically a way to measure how good you are at English, like how fluent you are across four, main communication skills.
Got it. And you mentioned, I think, earlier that there are like different versions of the test. What's the difference between them?
Right. So there are two main types of IELTS tests you'll come across, IELTS Academic and IELTS General Training. The academic version is mainly for people who want to go for higher education, so like university degrees or, those postgraduate studies. And then you have IELTS general training, and that one is usually what you need for work stuff or if you want to immigrate to certain countries.
Okay, so basically what you need the test for decides which one you take. But no matter which one, academic or general training, you still get tested on the same core skills, right?
Exactly. Both versions, they look at your listening, reading, writing, and speaking abilities. These are like the essentials for communicating well in English, and the test is really designed to see how you use them.
Okay, so then there's this whole band score system, right? Can you break down like what that's all about?
So with IELTS, they use a 9-band scoring system. It starts from a band score of 1, which basically means someone's not really a user of English, and it goes all the way up to a 9, which means you are an expert user. So you get a band score for each of those four skills and then an overall band score too.
So let's say someone wants to apply for a university or a visa. What kind of scores do they usually need?
Well, most universities for admission, they're looking for scores around 6.5 or 7. Now, for immigration, it's a bit trickier. It really changes a lot depending on the country and the type of visa you're going for. But usually you'll at least need a 6 or higher. But the best thing is to always check the exact score they need. Don't just go with general ideas.
Right, so always check the specifics. Makes sense. All right, so we've got a good overview. Let's dig deeper. Let's start with the listening section. What should people expect when they take that part?
Sure. So in the listening section, you basically have to go through 4 different audio recordings. It can be anything from everyday chats, like two people talking, to more formal stuff like monologues or even lectures. And the speakers and situations, they change to test how well you can understand English in different, real life situations.
Okay, so as you're listening, are there any like really good tips to, do well in this section?
One thing that can really help is to focus on those keywords, as you're listening. So before each recording starts, quickly go over the questions, underline or jot down those important words, things like nouns and verbs that carry the main meaning. This helps you get your ears ready for what you need to catch. And another super important thing is to practice listening to different English accents, like British, Australian, Canadian, all those. The recordings use different speakers, so you don't want to be surprised by an accent you've never heard before.
Oh yeah, that makes sense, the accents. It would be pretty tough if you're only used to one type, right? So after the listening section, there's like a 10-minute break, right? What should people do with that time?
Exactly. So at the end of listening, you get about 10 minutes to move your answers from the question booklet to a separate answer sheet. It's for transferring, but it's also your last chance to check everything, especially your spelling. Even a small mistake in spelling can cost you marks, so use those minutes to look over your answers and make corrections.
Right, double check that spelling. Always good advice. Okay, let's move on to reading. How is that different between academic and general training?
The main difference is in the type of texts you get. For IELTS academic reading, you'll have 3 long, kind of complicated passages. They're usually taken from academic journals, books, magazines, and they can be about some pretty dense, scholarly topics.
So more like academic style reading. What about general training? What will you see there?
For IELTS general training reading, the texts are shorter, and they come from everyday things you might see, if you lived in a place where they speak English. Stuff like ads, notices, memos, newspaper articles, official documents, instruction manuals, things like that. It's more about understanding practical information.
Okay, so different reading materials depending on what the test is for.
Mm.
But are there any, tips for doing well on both versions?
Yeah, definitely. Whether you're doing academic or general training, two things are super helpful. First, skim through the passages just to get the main idea before jumping into the questions. Think of it like making a mental map of the text. Then, when you look at the questions, use scanning techniques to find the specific info you need to answer them. Look for keywords or similar words in the text. And time management, that's super crucial for reading.
Why is managing your time so important in reading? It seems like you'd have a lot of time.
Well, you do get time, usually 60 minutes, to read and answer all the questions, but it's easy to spend too much time on one hard passage and then run out of time for the others. For the academic test, with those longer, more complex texts, a good plan is to give yourself like 20 minutes per passage. That way you can be sure to get to everything. You have to keep yourself on track and stick to the time you set for each part. That's how you'll get your best score.
Right, don't get stuck on one thing for too long. Gotcha. All right, let's move on to writing. I guess this one also has different tasks depending on academic or general training, right?
Right, exactly. The writing section has two tasks. Task 1 is different for each version, academic and general training, but Task 2 is the same for both.
So starting with task one, what's it like for the academic test?
In academic writing Task 1, you'll usually get something visual with data. Could be a graph, chart, table, or a diagram. And you have to describe what you see in your own words, pointing out the main trends, big changes, important features. You need to write at least 150 words for this one.
Okay, and what about general training writing task one?
So for general training task 1, you'll usually need to write a letter. It'll be based on, a certain situation or prompt they give you. Could be a formal complaint letter or a letter asking for information or even a less formal one to a friend or colleague. And again, it has to be at least 150 words.
Got it. So task one changes based on the test type. What about task two? What's that like?
Task 2 is the same for both academic and general training. They give you a question about an opinion or a problem, and you gotta write an essay answering it. You need to clearly say what you think, give reasons and examples, and organize your ideas in a way that makes sense, in a good structure. For task 2, you need at least 250 words.
So no matter which task, are there any general rules for good writing that apply to both?
Oh yeah, for sure. Structure is super important in both tasks. Always try to make clear paragraphs, each one focusing on one main idea. And using formal language is expected, especially in academic writing, and, for formal letters in the general training test. Of course, always keep an eye on the word count. Make sure you write at least the minimum they ask for. And try not to repeat yourself. Use different words and sentences to keep your writing interesting and show off your vocabulary. A good paragraph should have a topic sentence that introduces the main idea, then you give evidence or examples, and then a concluding sentence that either summarizes the main idea or smoothly moves you to the next paragraph. And don't forget those linking words and phrases. They're what make your writing flow smoothly.
Okay, great advice. Focus on structure, use the right language, hit the word count, don't repeat, and write strong paragraphs. Got it. Now let's talk about the last skill, speaking. This one seems a lot different because it's, face-to-face.
Yes, you're right. The speaking section is you actually talking with a certified IELTS examiner, and it takes like 11 to 14 minutes. It's all about seeing how well you can communicate, speaking in English in real time.
So what are the different parts of the speaking test? What should people expect?
So the speaking test has three parts. Part 1 is the introduction. The examiner asks you basic questions about yourself, things you like, your job or studies, and everyday stuff like where you're from or your hobbies. This part is to help you relax and to see how you handle basic conversation. Part 2 is the cue card. You get a card with the topic and some points to think about, you have a minute to prepare, and then you speak for around 2 minutes on the topic. After that, the examiner might ask a couple of follow-up questions. Part 3 is the discussion, and this is where you go deeper into the topic you talked about in Part 2. The questions here are usually more abstract and need you to give opinions, analyze things, and talk about bigger concepts.
So it starts with personal questions, then you have your own speaking time, and then a more, analytical discussion. What's the most important thing to keep in mind during the speaking test?
One of the biggest things is to focus on speaking smoothly and clearly, not on being perfectly grammatically correct. Examiners want to see you communicate your ideas well. Don't get too hung up on tiny grammar mistakes as long as they don't make it hard to understand you. And for better fluency, try the shadowing technique. Listen to native speakers and repeat after them at the same time, paying attention to their rhythm and tone. And of course, practice, practice, practice. Try answering a variety of sample questions, like the one we mentioned earlier. Describe a memorable trip. Recording yourself is also super helpful. You can see where you can improve your fluency, pronunciation, and how clear you sound overall.
Okay, that's good to know. So fluency is more important than absolute perfection. Are there any common mistakes people make in all four sections that we should be aware of?
Oh, yeah, there are a few. One big one, especially in reading and writing, is not managing time well and then, running out of time. We've said it before, but practicing with the clock ticking is really important so you get a feel for the pace you need for each section. Another common thing is people trying to make their answers too complicated, especially in writing and speaking. They try to use big words or really complex sentences to impress the examiner, but it can actually lead to more mistakes and make their communication worse, less clear. It's usually much better to keep your language simple, clear, and grammatically correct.
That's so true. Clarity and accuracy are often much better than being super complex.
Yeah.
What else do people tend to mess up on?
Another one is not reading the instructions carefully for each task and really understanding what they're asking for. It seems obvious, but lots of people lose points because they don't answer the question correctly. Like, for example, in academic writing task one, if they tell you to compare different data sets, you can't just describe each set separately, you have to compare them. If you don't, you're not really doing what they asked, and that will hurt your score. So pay attention to those little instruction words, they're important.
So those little words make a big difference. Now, getting ready for IELTS can feel kind of overwhelming. Are there any study resources you recommend to help people prepare?
There are some really good ones out there. First off, I'd definitely say use the official IELTS practice tests. You can find those in the Cambridge IELTS books. They have real test materials, like past papers, and they are super helpful for getting familiar with the format, the types of questions, and the timing of the actual test. They also give you a good idea of where you stand, skill-wise. And then you have some great YouTube channels just for IELTS prep. Channels like E2, IELTS, and IELTS Liz have tons of practical tips, strategies, and explanations of different question types. They even have practice exercises.
Any other resources that you think would be particularly helpful?
Yeah, there are some good apps too. The IELTS Prep app by the British Council is a good example. It's got practice activities, sample questions, and helpful insights into the test. And lastly, don't forget about doing mock tests under exam conditions. They're like a simulation of the real thing, and they help you get used to the timing and the pressure of the test day. Plus, you'll see what you're good at and what you need to work on so you can study more effectively.
Those are some awesome starting points. Now, we got a question from one of our listeners that fits in perfectly here. They asked, how long should I study for the IELTS? What's a general guideline you can give them?
That's a question we get a lot, and it's important. To be honest, the best study time really depends on a few things, like your English level right now and what score you want to get. But generally, for someone who's at like an intermediate English level and wants a score of 6.5, which is pretty common, we suggest around 6 to 8 weeks of focused study. But that's just a starting point, okay? If your English isn't that strong or you need a much higher band score, you'll probably need to study more. And if you're already pretty good at English, maybe you won't need to study as hard. The key is to really see where you're at, understand what score you need, and then plan your study time based on that.
So it really is personalized and self-assessment is key. As we wrap up our IELTS deep dive, what's the one thing you really want listeners to remember?
The most important thing is to remember that getting ready for IELTS is about improving your English skills by practicing consistently. It's not about memorizing the test format or finding shortcuts. Put in the time. Practice all four skills: listening, reading, writing, and speaking, and make sure you really understand the structure and what's expected of you in the test. That consistent effort and practice, that's what will get you the results you want.
Totally agree. And don't forget, as you're preparing, believe in yourself and your ability to learn and get better. It's a tough test, but if you approach it the right way, use the right resources, and put in the work, you can definitely get the score you need and open up those opportunities you're going for.
Yeah, try to change how you think about the IELTS. Don't see it as just another obstacle. See it as a chance to show off your English skills, which will help you in so many ways going forward.
Absolutely. To all our listeners prepping for the IELTS, keep practicing, stay confident, and don't be afraid to use those resources we talked about. And if you have more questions about the IELTS as you're studying, reach out to us. We're always happy to help.
And one last thought. When you go through the process of mastering a standardized test like IELTS, it really shows how well you can communicate, follow instructions, and stick with something until you reach your goal. These are valuable skills, not just for the test, but for your studies, your career, your life in general, wherever you end up.
That's a good point.
Thanks for listening, everyone.